Yes, there's a place called Theresienstadt, which was in the Czech Republic. Now, Theresienstadt was a a military fortress that was started in the 1700s by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was named after the emperor's mother, Maria Theresa. But Theresienstadt basically was a sort of transit camp. It was not a destruction camp, and basically it was established initially in 1941 from Jews from Czechoslovakia. Then German war veterans from First World War came there, and later on some Hungarian Jews came, and basically the concept was that it was sort of a transit camp before they deported them, people to the east and like Auschwitz place like that. Now during the 4 years, something like 140,000 people went through the place, and I mean what the Germans tried to do was sort of a elite camp. In fact, they made a documentary film, the town that Hitler gave to the Jews, and then sort of made a documentary with all nonsense. They had a Red Cross delegation came in '94 inspect, how well the Jews were treated by and in many ways it was sort of self-administered by a Jewish town councilman. They're totally under the command of the SS. So, but it's sort of in many ways not like some of the camps in the East, but it was still insufficient food, insufficient medicine. Some 30,000 people died of natural causes there, and it was when it was liberated at the end of in early 1945 when the Soviet army advanced and all the camps in the east were liquidated. They brought something like 3,000 people back to Theresienstadt. Now, there were things going on. They were building all sorts of weird structures, and if the war had lasted long, that probably would have liquidated everything. But then, time overtook them. So it was sort of it wasn't as sort of severe as Auschwitz, all those places, but it's still, lack of food, lack of sanitations. You can imagine that in a place that normally, in normal times, the town had about a population of 3,500. When you had something like 45 to 50,000 people crammed into at one time, you can sort of visualize some of the conditions. There's sort of 3-tier bunks in large rooms, like people in the attic. So that basically was, Theresienstadt. And in many ways, it was probably a milder form of what went on in the rest of Europe. Really, you didn't know, because first of all, the train at that stage only went to a place about 4 kilometers from Theresienstadt, and you walked the last 4 kilometers. In 1943, they extended the railway line, but you didn't really understand. I mean, once again, I was 8, so your impression is slightly different. But obviously, it was a sort of strange place. Had a lot of people, armed guards all around, and you're allocated to a particular place. So it was confusing in many ways. But once again, when you're an adult, you've got a point of reference what normal life was. When you're a kid, you don't really have that sort of reference point. So you just adopt things day by day. It's not normal life, but you acclimatise up to a point. There were two sets. There was the SS, of course, but the day-to-day administration was by the Czech field police. And by and large, they're pretty decent. But then again, the SS, I mean, they did also. In fact, there's one guy there, I think he was of Polish extraction, he's a corporal. He used to drive 3-ton trucks, and he had a particular hobby, running people down. That was his thing. So it varies. Different commanders had different sort of ways of doing things. So once again, you sort of look. The best thing you did was sort of keep your head down, keep out of the way. When you saw someone in uniform, you sort of went round the corner. Sort of worked somewhere. But look, the thing was, and this is one of the thing that's often been come up, sort of in historians. You probably, I don't know whether you've heard about the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Well, there's always the question, why didn't this happen in other places? Well, I think, and look, this is a more theory, that people believed, well, this will be over soon. And really, no, they didn't really want to sort of take that extra step for him in danger. I mean, at the end of the day, it didn't matter because the end result for most people, we all know. But that probably, and also, particularly amongst a very large contingent of interiors were basically, from Germany, and a lot of them were First World veterans. And they had that sort of inbuilt thing that you don't revolt against authority. I mean, this is the sort of, that's been there for centuries. And that is, but I think basically it was, well, look, we'll keep our head down, it'll be over very soon. Well, obviously it wasn't, but I think that is probably the underlying things why they weren't. Not really. I mean, once again, when you're that age, you sort of, you're not really into these escape plan. Besides, where would you have gone? I mean, the surrounding countryside probably wasn't. The Czechs were quite good, but then again, the place was occupied. Where else would you go? I mean, you had no documents, you had no, no sort of money. I mean, it probably, maybe some of the adults had these ideas, but no, I certainly didn't, because it just didn't occur. Well, there probably were, because there was artists, there was writers, there's cultural groups formed themselves. I mean, there was no schooling. Probably people who worked in certain areas had a connection. Once again, I think you just live day by day. I mean, as I said, kids, and in fact, when I did the one with the Spielberg Foundation, one with the Holocaust Center, the interviewer said, how did you feel about that? I said, look, this is a nonsense question, because when you're a child, you don't have that point of reference of what is normal life. So, in fact, we had argument's probably wrong, but got the point, so look, let's move on this. We're not going to agree on this. Like all human sort of groups, some were, others, me first, never mind about the rest. Look, and I think particularly under unusual circumstances, this becomes far more focused. That, you get people who are, look after people, you get other people who say, me, never mind about the rest. So, and that probably, particularly with sort of outside strains, this becomes far more relevant, pronounced. Sure, there's quite a few sadistic, but then again, a lot of them, in fact, there's a case just now in Germany where they've charged a 97-year-old man who was a guard at Ravensbrück. I mean, he was an 18-year-old conscript. Now, look, I'm not defending him, but what I'm saying is, a lot of them were conscripts, and I mean, I always ask myself, if I had been on the other side, how would I have acted? Would I have said, look, I'm not doing this, or would I have said, well, Look, it's a very difficult question, particularly in hindsight, because, I mean, you take people who are conscripted to the army. Now, killing enemies Was that a war crime, or was that part of what they were there for? Look, it's a question that really very, very hard to quantify. I mean, there's so many. I mean, what I would say, and this is the point. I had an interesting case when I was in Germany, talking to schools. After after we finished, one lad came up to me, and he said, "Look, my grandfather was a guard at Auschwitz. I mean, how would you view me?" And I said, "Look, your generation, it wasn't you. So I mean, how can you sort of put that in context? So how can you say to the people who are the guards? I mean, I'm not defending them, but I mean they're part of the system, and the system was rotten, and did they follow orders? Because if they hadn't, they would have been put up against the wall and shot. Did they do it out of sort of personal satisfaction, doing things like that? Look, I don't think you actually put a logical answer to that question. You had no idea. You had no idea. I mean, I'll tell you, in 1944, when the Americans started daylight bombing of Germany, and we're in the flight path, when you saw, and usually they came over during the day, you had some feeling, look, something's sort of, something's happening. Something will, there must be a time when all this will end. But, it was pure guesses. I'll tell you some of the things this would generate. There was a couple of adventurous fellows who spread a rumour. They wanted to test the Bush telegraph. That I think the original message was that 20 tanks were outside Prague. Within an hour, the story was that an American army had invaded Prague. They will be here next day. So that's a sort of mass psychology exercise. But you really don't know what, because very little outside sort of news filtered in. Mm-hmm. And some of that did, particularly the atrocities, either the sort of camp of Jewish authorities didn't know about it, or that if they did, they didn't want to spread it, not cause extra panic. So once again, it's a sort of fluid situation in these things. I mean, which is the fact, which is sort of hopeful fantasy. Look, in many ways, life wasn't normal. Life went on. You sort of had your group of friends. You did things. So, but I think the positive memory was that you're still here. I think that really is that life sort of started again once the war was over. Admittedly, it was in different phases, sort of changing countries, changing cultures. But I think that is the positive memory. Oh, look, there's always funny things happen because, there's the sort of thing. Well, I don't know if it was actually funny, but for preparing for the Red Cross visit, they put up, they opened up cafes, they opened up, shops, and they sort of built sort of great things and public entertainments. It was all fake. In fact, I think I mentioned this before, back in the days of the Russian Tsar, when the Tsar travelled to the provinces, there was sort of one court official who went ahead and beautified the place and all that and put up facades, one Potemkin. And when all this was happening in Terezin, some wit sort of brought out this little ditty saying, if Potemkin knew what was going on in Terezin, he would turn his grave because he's been far surpassed in his efforts. Oh, look, there's always sort of fun things, there was all sorts. There's always, this is what I run the course in family history at U3A, what I tell students, that no matter how dark the history is, there's always light, there's always something, and you've got to put that into light and shade. Not really, because were a number of, in fact, Melbourne outside Israel is the largest, or was, because a lot of them are gone now, the largest Holocaust survivor community in the world. And there's about 5 or 6 people here that were in terrorism with us. I mean, a lot of them obviously are now gone to the big camp in the sky. So yeah, there's quite a few. Well, you did in your circles. I mean, there was a number of friends. There was, and when we sort of had to go to work in the tailor shop, there was a group of us who sort of had a bit of a connection with each other.
What did you do in the tailor shop?
We mended uniform that came back from the Eastern Front, and this sort of might be a very perverse sort of feeling, but in many ways, whenever we saw some bullet holes, it was sort of, oh, good, there's one less of them. But I mean, actually, my I made shoulder pads. That was my speciality. Oh, look, you probably did have good days, It's probably, when in summer when the weather was good, you sort of sit outside somewhere. But once again, it's sort of like anything else in life, probably more sort of focused on things. But you've got good days, get bad days when things sort of happen. But look, in many ways, it was a normal life in the most abnormal sort of setting. I mean, you got up in the morning, you did this, you did that. So in some ways, you had a routine. I mean, once again, it's that age distinction. When you're a kid with no background reference points, it's a totally different scenario than when you're an adult and you remember normal life. A couple of people, most of the others have sort of died. In fact, a friend of mine, I saw him yesterday, there's about half a dozen people we still have fairly close contact with. Well, I think it's sort of a great dawning in your life that it's all over and life will return to some sort of normal. Mind you, then of course we had this transition we knew that we were going to go to Australia, but it took about almost 2 years while all the paperwork was done, and also transport was, shipping. That stage, most countries used their shipping to repatriate their armed forces. But you knew that another transition would happen. But then again, normal life resumed. You went to school, you did things. So once again, it's sort of a half and half situation. I don't think, well, not really, because we've never sort of strictly ultra-orthodox. And it's actually very interesting that some of the ultra-orthodox then married German Aryan women, non-Jewish women, and they're sort of almost saying, well, there can't be a God, how could God permit this happening? But to us, really, it didn't really, I mean, we're traditional. We sort of observe certain things. It's more of a cultural sort of a background with us. So I don't think it really did. Well, the ones who took part, yes, but then again, I mean, as I said, I've been to Germany 6 or 7 times in the last 30 odd years, and I go and talk to groups, to schools about things, and look, you can't, I mean, you've got to understand you're into the 3rd generation now, and you really cannot sort of blame the sons of the sins of the fathers. And quite a few people in Germany now sort of have that same, they want to sort of make up, and but once again, you now got the rise of the the right wing, and some of these historians say never happened. So yes, I do feel animosity towards that generation. But as I said, one day we may forgive, we must never forget, because I think that is and this is why I'm involved with organisation Encourage to Care. We go and talk to schools about prejudice, and sort of Holocaust almost the wallpaper, the background. And that really is, I mean, what's happening in Shepparton at the moment, there's all sorts of bullying, but I think there's a lot of racism behind it. And we've had a number of exhibitions over the years in Shepparton. And I think it's so important to tell the future generation, what happened. Because was it, I think it was Plato, that those who don't recall history will be forced to relive it. I think that is really the important thing. And that's why, so whenever I have a chance to go to Germany, and I speak to schools, I speak to groups, and that, it's interesting. And in fact, there's an article in the paper somewhere the other day that now in Germany, the governments are still putting up monuments and blah, blah, blah. But the current generation are more saying, look, let's put a line and let's move on, let's not talk about all this. And I think that's a sort of syndrome. But the thing is that I think it's important to keep the story, to pass it on, because of what happened. And that's the other thing I've experienced when I've sort of spoken over there, that kids come up to me and they actually is a school subject, the Holocaust, but they come up and say, look, we learn about this, but actually to talk to someone who was there, it's a whole different, makes the thing come alive. I think that really is so it's no good saying, look, it's been, let's forget it. I think it's important, not because of, we want to tell the story, but for the steps to the future. Initially it was a bit strange because I hadn't really been to school, and also we had this sort of thing, we knew we were going to leave, so sort of, when is it going to happen, what's the plan? So no, look, I'll justify once again that when you're a kid, it's much easier to adjust to things, because you look at things. Well, basically, we're given a flat, we're given things, and my father started a small business. So, in many ways it became a reasonably regulated life. Yeah, look, the General Army basically were conscripts. The SS were sort of hand-picked, sadists, most of them. In fact, I had a very interesting discussion a couple of times when I was in Germany with the then Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, who was Irving Rommel's son, the Desert Fox. And he was saying that Rommel, now Irving, the Field Marshal, had very great regard for the Australian troops, despite that they were on the other side. So look, the army, in many ways, most of the army were conscripts. And but the SS were hand-picked sadists. there's no, I understand, I've read some transcript, that one of the questions was, when you volunteered for the SS, one of the questions was, can you carry out sadistic acts? That was one of the basic interview questions when you applied. But also you must understand that for generations these people have been sort of inoculated with the concept that all these other people are not really humans, they're subhumans, and that really fostered the way they carried on, the Aryan race up there and all the subhumans over there. So psychologists can probably give you a far better answer than I can. Well, my two grandparents on my mother's side, my grandmother on my father's side, my father's my father's sister, and a few other sort of outer family, but they're the immediate inner family. Probably the fact that you limit your sort of behind barbed wire, you're limited, that you couldn't really do what you wanted to go, where you wanted to go. You didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Well, there was one instance where they decided in 1943 they're going to have a census of the camp. There were 30,000 people there. We all got marched out to a sort of outside the camp. There's like a huge hollow, sort of a meadow type of thing with hills around it. And from early in the morning till late at night, they kept counting and recounting. And a number of people sort of dropped dead, no food, no water. And then as it got dark, there was spotlights on the surrounding hill and machine guns. So that probably was, you didn't really know what was going to happen to you because, sort of from minute to minute. And then after dark, everyone got marched back in the camp. So I still to this day don't know, was this a sort of a bureaucratic exercise that the Germans loved numbers, or was there something more sadistic behind it? It's something I've never really discovered. That probably was the time when you're out there in the open and sort of, that I think probably would rate high on the scale of things. Now this probably sounds a little bit silly, that it gave you a sense of belonging, that you knew that you were ostracized, but you knew you're part of a group that shared the same fate. I don't even answer that because once again, the child syndrome comes in. Children are not really expected to make any decisions. Possibly if I had been an adult, the decision would have been to leave Europe. That wasn't my part, but see, this is one of the, in a broader picture, one of the tragedy that befell German Jews. That when it all started, back in 1933, they said, this is not going to last, this is rubbish, it'll go away. And by the time they realized it's not going to change, go away, most countries wouldn't sort of accept anybody. I think that was, if I had been an adult then, maybe I would have decided, said, look, let's get out of Europe, this is not the place. But look, hypothetical. Well, never again. Never let it happen again. Whether we have control over that, but that really is, the catch cry of this. And this is one of the things without, I'm probably straying into sort of global politics now, that this is one of the sort of rationale of the state of Israel. That there is a place, if things happen, where Jews can go. But look, I know there's another thing this morning about they've now declared the racist, but that's a totally different. But I think that probably is the bottom basic rule: never let it happen again. I think that really is, the bottom line. I can't answer that. I really cannot answer that. Education of everybody, perhaps, these things should never happen again, but I really cannot give you, I'd be Socrates if I knew the answer to that. There's something I read the other day, I think out of a conference in America, that the gas chambers weren't the start of the Holocaust. The start of the Holocaust was way back, sort of decade or even century ago, where this prejudice against certain groups sort of was allowed to arise in communities. Be it sort of prejudice against the African Americans in America, be it against the Hutus, the Tutsis in Africa. I think that really is it's the early sort of prejudices that arise without being so this, I probably shouldn't say this off the record, but in Europe, a lot of this started back 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, the way, particularly in country place of the Catholic Church, how they sort of propagated this, the Jews killed Jesus. I think that, and they propagated this, and that sort of eventually, solidified this prejudice and sort of went on to other things. I think it's frightening. I mean, we've seen it before. We've saying, "Well, look, they're a fringe group," but fringe group have a, particularly when there's sort of economic problems, world problems, people tend to sort of gravitate towards these things because they're unhappy with what their own position, their situation, unhappy what the government is sort of saying and imposing or not imposing. I think this is why it's so important to keep telling the story. That to say, oh well, look, they're just a fringe group, nobody take. Well, that's how it all started back in Europe, back in the 20s. Look, I think basically people are probably tend to be good rather than evil, but I think there's certain triggers that even reasonable people, for all sorts of unknown reasons, tend to move towards the dark side. On what logic do you base your prejudices? I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, this wasn't in a bad way, but I remember when I was an apprentice, I was on one of the building sites where, I don't know, I was sitting around having tea at lunchtime, and a fellow said, "Oh, look, the Jews are all bad." I said, "Well, have you ever met one?" He said, No, you're probably the first one I've met. And it's sort of this concept that people get in their minds that the business, all Jews are rich and all Jews. I mean, it's once again, it's ignorance that starts all these things. That people pick up things they don't really understand the background of it. So I think once again, the more you can converse with lots of people and sort of tell the story, tell your point of view, see their point of view, and perhaps say, look, I think you haven't quite got the facts. I think that's what it's all about. It's communications between people and spreading knowledge. I've always sort of taken life as it comes. Sure, you've got certain hang-ups about this, but you look forward to each new day. You make mistakes, so well, I hope I don't make the mistake again. I think really, if you, the woman I met in Stuttgart, she also was a child in Stuttgart who went to Theresienstadt. And we worked out when we were there on a couple of occasions, we're the only two kids, Jewish kids from Stuttgart, who survived Theresienstadt. But Inge, I mean, I feel sorry for her. She travels and lectures all over the world, but that's her life. She doesn't look forward. She's never married, she hasn't got any kids, and for her, the past is her life. And that to me is totally counterproductive. I mean, sure, you remember the past, but you move on. There's the future out there. And I think that's different, but basically, it's a stark contrast between her and me. That's her life, talking about the past and doing this and that. To me, all right, the past, you relate, but you move forward. There's things out there. Well, using sort of lyrics of an old song, I think it came from Monty Python. Always look for the bright side of life. I think that really, look for the positives, not the negatives. I think that really is, I don't know if you ever read about the Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher. Well, there's a book he wrote, I'm trying to think of the title. Anyway, the opening paragraph is, there are two men sitting in a dark dungeon. One only sees the dirt and the misery. The other one looks through the bars and sees the sunlight and looks to the future. I think that really is the message, that no matter what you're in, look on what could be the positive side, not the negative, because the negative is there, and if you let it overwhelm you, well, that's the end of the path. I think it's important for people to tell their stories. That's what I keep saying when I run the course, that it's not just family history people are writing of their own family or world. They're opening a window into a time, into a place, into a concept. I think that is really important, that you're sharing, you know, a vision that you have experienced that the others, obviously, because time is gone. But I think that is important because, I mean, Wyatt might be talking on his family histories, but opening a window into a place, into a time, into events, into a community. I think that is really the bottom line. That everybody, well, I think I've mentioned this before, but there was a cop show in the 60s in America, The Naked City, that, I mean, the show itself is not an American cop show, but at the end of each episode there's a voiceover. There are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. I mean, that really is the very concept of all these sort of family and other histories, that everybody has a story. And many, sort of, they might be similar, but each one has a particular unique element to it. Oh, goodbye, keep well.